Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back in time, way back, to a world lit only by flickering firelight and dictated by the rhythm of the sun and the seasons. Imagine for a moment standing in a small, drafty cottage somewhere in rural Europe in the year 1692. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and maybe a hint of drying herbs. Outside, the wind whistles through the thatch, a constant reminder of the elements you live at the mercy of. You clutch a piece of coarse dark bread, your primary meal made from the grain that sustains your village, your family. You. This simple act of eating, this fundamental requirement for survival, carries a hidden risk you couldn't possibly comprehend. Tonight we're going to explore a period where this basic necessity turns sinister, leading to fear, accusations, and suffering on a scale that feels both ancient and eerily cautionary. You probably won't survive a trip through 1692 without modern medicine, but hey, at least you're warm and safe in bed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You exist in a world that feels in many ways slower, heavier than the one you know. Time isn't measured in seconds or minutes, ticking away on a glowing screen, but by the angle of the sun, the length of shadows, the crowing of the rooster, the tolling of the distant church bell. Life is undeniably hard. You wake before dawn often to the chill bite of the morning air, layers of rough, homespun fabric, your only defense against the cold. Your days are spent in relentless physical labor, tilling the soil, sowing seeds, tending livestock, hauling water, mending clothes, preparing food over an open fire. There are no supermarkets overflowing with endless choices, no instant delivery of anything you might desire. Your existence is tethered directly to the land around you, to its generosity and its unpredictable moods. And what is the cornerstone of this existence for so many across Northern and Eastern Europe? It's not the fine wheat that makes puffy white loaves you might occasionally dream of. That's often a luxury for the wealthy, for the town dwellers. For you, it is rye. This hardy, resilient grain is the very foundation of your diet, the bedrock of your caloric intake. You don't just eat rye bread, you live on it. It's breakfast, it's lunch, it's dinner. It's the fuel that powers your body through long days of backbreaking work. Without rye, there is no survival. It grows where other grains might fail, standing tall, even in less fertile soil, and tolerating harsher climates. This adaptability makes it indispensable, the unsung hero of countless villages and farms. You see fields of it stretching across the landscape, a sea of green in spring turning to golden brown as summer ripens the stalks. The annual harvest is the most critical event of the year, the moment of truth that determines if you and your family will have enough to eat through the long, lean months of winter. The village collective holds its breath during planting, prays during the growing season, and exhales a mixture of relief and exhaustion during the harvest. Life is precarious, a constant dance on the edge of scarcity. A bad harvest doesn't just mean less food, it can mean starvation. Disease isn't something kept at bay by vaccines and sterile environments. It's a constant looming threat able to sweep through a community with terrifying speed and little understanding. You might lose a child to a fever, a grandparent to consumption, a neighbor to a sudden inexplicable illness. Medical knowledge is rudimentary at best, a mix of inherited wisdom, superstition, and the limited understanding of local healers, often relying on herbal remedies or practices that seem bizarre by modern standards. You accept illness as a part of life, a trial perhaps sent by God or caused by malevolent spirits, a consequence of ill humors or bad air. The idea that something microscopic, something invisible to the naked eye, could be the source of suffering is simply beyond comprehension. You might walk through your village, the muddy track squelching underfoot, past low-roofed cottages with smoke curling from their chimneys. You see faces weathered by sun and wind hands calloused by work. Everyone knows everyone else's business, for better or worse. Community is vital. You rely on each other for help with the harvest, for support in times of trouble, for shared rituals and celebrations. There are no lonely apartment buildings here. Your life is intertwined with the lives of your neighbors. The year 1692, as you stand in it, is just another year in the cycle of seasons. You have no idea that in a faraway place, Salem, Massachusetts, events are unfolding that will echo through history, driven by a different kind of fear, a different kind of accusation. But here in your corner of Europe, a silent, less understood threat is lurking, a threat that has been present perhaps for generations, but is poised to make its presence felt in a particularly horrifying way. This threat doesn't come from disgruntled neighbors or spectral visions. It comes from the very food that sustains you, from the rye you depend upon. Historians still argue whether rye's dominance in these regions was primarily due to its resilience in poor soils or its lower market price compared to wheat. But whatever the primary driver, the result was the same: a vast population base relying almost exclusively on this single grain. This dependence, this lack of dietary diversity, created a perfect storm for a problem you couldn't yet name. It's a bit like putting all your digital eggs in one cloud storage basket. If that basket fails, well, you're in for a bad time. Except for them, the stakes were literally life and death. Consider the mundane reality of your bread. It's dark, dense, and often quite sour. It might be mixed with other grains, or even things like dried peas or beans to stretch the supply depending on the season and the yield. It's baked in communal ovens or in your own hearth, a daily or weekly ritual, depending on the fuel supply and time. There's a certain comfort in its predictability, in the knowledge that this simple loaf is your hedge against hunger. But there's a vulnerability to a single point of failure in your food chain that you are utterly unaware of. Think about the fields again. You've walked them countless times, watched the rye grow. You've seen the occasional weed, the signs of insect damage, perhaps even strange growths or discolorations that you might attribute to bad luck, poor soil, or just the mysterious ways of nature. There's no concept of microscopic spores drifting on the wind, invisible agents of decay and disease. You don't analyze your crops with magnifying glasses or send samples to a laboratory. Your knowledge comes from generations of practical experience, passed down through observation and tradition. A bad patch in the field. Maybe the ground is cursed, or the rain came at the wrong time, or the sun was too fierce. You accept it and move on, hoping the rest of the harvest will compensate. A quirky tidbit from this era is that while most people focused on practical farming, there were pockets of interest in improving crops, often driven by wealthy landowners or early scientific thinkers. But even these efforts were limited by a lack of understanding of basic botany and biology as we know it. They might try different fertilizers, including some rather fragrant options you definitely wouldn't want near your modern picnic, or different planting methods, but they weren't looking for fungal contamination in the way a modern agronomist would. The idea of a fungus infecting a healthy grain head was probably as foreign to them as the internet is to you right now. The sheer physical effort of life dominates everything. Your body aches most days. You feel the cold deep in your bones in winter and the oppressive heat in summer. Sleep is often interrupted by the needs of the farm, the cries of children, or the simple discomforts of a rough bed. You have no concept of ergonomics or work-life balance. Life is work, interspersed with moments of prayer, community gatherings, and the occasional simple pleasure. This constant struggle for survival makes you resilient, but it also leaves you vulnerable to anything that disrupts the delicate balance. When strange things start happening, when the bread that is supposed to nourish you seems to be doing something else entirely, your frame of reference is limited. You look to the things you understand: curses, spirits, divine displeasure, or perhaps just a particularly nasty form of fever. The possibility that the very stuff of life, the rye itself, could be the culprit in a way you can't see or touch is almost unimaginable. You trust the grain, you trust the harvest, because you have no other choice. This trust, this fundamental reliance, is about to be tested in the most terrifying way. You are standing unknowingly on the precipice of a crisis that will sweep through communities, leaving a trail of suffering and confusion, a crisis hidden inside the humble loaf of bread. The stage is set. The players are the villagers, the rye, and a silent, microscopic adversary. The scene is waiting for the curtain to rise. You wake with the sun, or perhaps just before it, the dim light filtering through the small unglazed window. The air inside the cottage is thick with the lingering scent of yesterday's fire and the subtle, earthy smell of damp straw used for bedding. Your muscles protest as you rise. The aches from yesterday's labor are your constant companions. Today, like most days, begins in the fields, and the fields mean rye. Cultivating rye in 1692 is not like tending a modern garden box, or even operating a tractor across vast flat plains. This is manual labor, pure and unadulterated. You walk out the cool morning air, biting at your face the ground beneath your worn shoes, often uneven, sometimes muddy, sometimes hard-baked, depending on the season. The tools you use are ancient, simple, and effective, but they demand immense physical effort. You might start by preparing the soil. This involves plowing a back-breaking task often done with oxen or horses if you are fortunate enough to own or share draft animals. If not, it's you, your family, and your neighbors breaking the earth with shovels and hoes, turning the heavy soil to prepare it for planting. Imagine the repetitive motion, the strain on your back, and arms, the feel of the rough wood handle in your calloused hands. It's a rhythm dictated by necessity, a slow, steady effort that defines your existence. Once the soil is turned, the planting begins. Rye is typically sown in the autumn, allowing it to establish roots before the deep cold sets in. You walk the rows, scattering the seeds by hand, a practiced motion, developed over years, hoping for an even distribution. The seeds fall onto the prepared earth, tiny promises of future sustenance. There's no precise science here, no controlled machinery. It's a dance with nature, relying on instinct, tradition, and prayer. You cover the seeds perhaps with a light harrow, or simply by dragging branches across the ground, wishing them well before the winter snows arrive. Through the harsh winter months, the rye lies dormant, protected under blankets of snow or enduring the biting frosts. You hope it survives, that the cold doesn't kill the young sprouts, that pests don't burrow into the soil and consume the seeds. This waiting period is filled with other tasks: repairing tools, tending livestock, spinning wool, mending clothes. But the fate of the rye is a constant underlying worry. Your future, your family's future, depends entirely on its resilience. Spring finally arrives, a welcome relief after the long, dark winter. You watch anxiously as the first green shoots emerge from the warming earth. The fields come alive, transforming from brown and white to a vibrant green. Now begins the tireless battle against weeds and pests. You spend hours bent over in the rows, pulling weeds by hand, protecting the precious rye stalks. There are no herbicides, no insecticides, as you know them. Your only weapons are vigilance, hard work, and the hope that nature will be kind. You might scatter ash or other natural deterrents, relying on folk wisdom passed down through generations, but largely you are at the mercy of the natural world. As summer approaches, the rye grows taller, the stalks thickening, swaying in the breeze like green waves. The grain heads begin to form, promising the kernels that will fill your granary. This is a period of intense anticipation. You watch the weather constantly. Too much rain can waterlog the fields, encouraging rot or mold. Too little rain can stunt growth, leading to a meager harvest. Hail can devastate a crop in minutes. A sudden frost can kill the developing grain. Every day is a gamble, a prayer that the elements will cooperate. Historians still argue whether the reliance on rye in northern and eastern Europe was solely a matter of its hardiness, or also driven by economic factors that made it more accessible to the vast majority of the population compared to wheat. What is clear is that this single crop was not just a food source. It was the axis around which life revolved. Your entire year was structured by the rye cycle, preparing the fields, planting, tending, harvesting, threshing, milling, baking. It was the calendar, the clock, and the bank all rolled into one. The harvest, when it finally arrives in late summer or early autumn, is a frenzy of activity. The entire village pitches in. Using simple sickles or scythes, you cut the stalks by hand, bundling them into sheaves. It's incredibly demanding work hours spent stooping, cutting, and gathering under the hot sun. The air is filled with the rustle of stalks, the sharp scent of cut grain, and the drone of insects. Your hands are raw, your back is screaming, but there's a sense of urgency, a shared purpose that transcends the discomfort. You know that every sheaf gathered is another step towards security, towards survival through the coming winter. A quirky tidbit about harvesting, sometimes leftover stubble, was intentionally left taller after cutting, providing grazing for animals in the post-harvest fields. A simple, practical use of resources that shows how little was wasted. After cutting, the sheaves are often left in the field to dry or stacked into stooks. Then comes the threshing, separating the grain from the stalks. This is often done by beating the sheaves with flails, or sometimes by having animals walk over them. It's dusty, noisy work, filling the air with chaff and grain. You winnow the grain, tossing it in the air so the wind blows away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier kernels behind. This is a rudimentary process reliant on the wind and the skill of the person doing the winnowing. It's effective enough for the purpose, but it also means that smaller, lighter debris and even things mixed in with the grain might not always be completely removed. This entire process from plowing to winnowing is fraught with vulnerability. There's no safety net. A single bad season can mean disaster. You have limited means to protect your crop from disease or pests that you can't even see. Your understanding of the world is based on what you can observe, touch, smell, and hear. A withered patch in the field might be seen as bad luck, a strange growth on a stalk, as a peculiarity of nature, or perhaps even a sign of witchcraft or divine displeasure. The complex biological interactions, the microscopic life that can affect plant health, are completely outside your frame of reference. Imagine the simple hope and relief you feel as the grain is finally stored, either in communal granaries or in sacks in your own home. This pile of grain represents life itself. It will feed your family, maybe provide a small surplus to trade for other necessities. It is the culmination of a year's worth of brutal labor and anxious waiting. But within this stored grain, a hidden danger could be lurking, something that made its way in during the planting, growing, harvesting, or threshing, something that the simple winnowing process didn't remove. This vulnerability in the farming process, this reliance on basic methods and sheer physical effort, meant that if something unseen contaminated the crop, it was almost guaranteed to end up in the food supply. You trust the rye because you have no other choice, but the trust is built on a foundation of limited knowledge, a foundation about to be shaken by a hidden invisible threat. So there you are, looking at your precious store of rye, the result of all that backbreaking work, the promise of nourishment and survival. You dip your hand into a sack, or perhaps scoop some out of the communal bin. As the kernels pour through your fingers, you might notice something off. Mixed in with the golden brown rye grains, there are small dark pieces. Some look like misshapen elongated grains. Others are distinctly purplish black, hard and brittle, often curved like tiny horns or even rodent droppings if you aren't paying close attention. You might pick one out, crush it between your fingers. It feels different from the grain, dense and maybe a little powdery inside. These are the sclerotia of a fungus, specifically Claviceps purpurea, commonly known as ergot. You of course don't know any of this in 1692. You don't know the word fungus, let alone sclerotia or purpurea. You just see these dark bits. Maybe you assume they are burnt grains that got mixed in during drying or threshing. Maybe you think it's a particularly stubborn weed seed. Or maybe if the problem is widespread in your harvest, you see it as a blight, a disease that has afflicted your crop, a sign of bad soil or unfavorable weather, or perhaps something more sinister like a curse or divine disapproval. The ergot develops in the rye field before harvest. It starts when spores of the fungus land on the flowers of the rye plant. Instead of the flower developing into a normal grain kernel, the fungus takes over, feeding on the plant's nutrients and growing into this hard, dark structure that replaces the grain. It often happens during wet periods, especially around flowering time. So if the summer was particularly damp or rainy, just as your rye was blooming, the chances of ergot infection increased dramatically. These ergot bodies are tougher than the grain kernels and have a different shape and weight. During the winnowing process you performed in the field or threshing area, where you toss the grain in the air to let the wind blow away the lighter chaff, some of the lighter or smaller ergot bodies might have been carried away. But the larger, denser ones, especially those that closely mimic the size and shape of a rye kernel, would fall right back down with the good grain. Your simple tools and methods just weren't equipped to separate them effectively. It's like trying to filter sand with a sieve made for gravel. Some small stones are just going to slip through. And you wouldn't have had any reason to try and filter specifically for these dark bits because you didn't know they were dangerous. They were just part of the harvest, and imperfection perhaps, but not a threat. So these ergot bodies, carrying their hidden payload of potent chemicals, made their way into your sacks of grain. And when you took that grain to the mill to be ground into flour, whether it was the local miller you trusted or your own small hand mill, those dark bits were ground right along with the good kernels. The miller wouldn't have picked them out, and you wouldn't have asked them to. Why would you? They're just dark bits, right? Adds a little color. Maybe affects the taste slightly, making the bread a bit bitter or peppery. But hey, that's just how it is sometimes with rye bread, isn't it? Maybe that's why your neighbor Martha's bread sometimes tastes a bit spicy. You never really thought about it before. Joke 1. Perhaps they thought it was the medieval version of extra flavor crystals. Historians still argue whether isolated communities in certain regions might have had some fragmented folk knowledge about avoiding grain with these dark growths, perhaps noticing that eating bread made from visibly tainted grain seemed to correlate with sickness. However, this knowledge, if it existed at all, wasn't widespread, wasn't understood scientifically, and certainly wasn't universally applied. For the vast majority, these were just imperfections, not poison. The understanding that these specific dark kernels were the cause of a terrible disease was still centuries away from becoming common knowledge. Think about the sheer volume of grain. You're not sifting through a small bowlful for breakfast. You're dealing with bushels and bushels of rye harvested to last your family or your entire community through the year. Picking out every single tiny dark piece would be an impossible, thankless task, even if you suspected they were undesirable. You'd be there forever. It's far easier, far more practical, and completely normal by the standards of the day to just grind it all up together. A mainstream historical fact is that while ergot contaminated grain was a known problem visually, its connection to human illness was largely anecdotal and misunderstood for centuries across Europe. People knew bad grain could make you sick, but didn't know why or identify the specific culprit. A quirky tidbit: in some historical records describing grain, blights these dark ergot bodies were sometimes referred to with names related to horns or nails due to their shape completely oblivious to their true nature as a fungal growth. They were just strange contaminants. So the rye flour produced from your contaminated harvest contains not just the nutritious grain, but also the ground-up ergot bodies. And that flour is what you use to bake your daily bread, your primary source of calories and sustenance. You mix it with water, maybe some leavening if you have it kneaded with hands accustomed to the rough feel of the dough, and bake it in your oven. The heat of baking doesn't destroy the toxins within the ergot. They are remarkably stable. So the danger persists baked right into the staff of life. Joke 2. It's the ultimate surprise ingredient that nobody asked for. It really puts those questionable mystery casseroles from potlucks into perspective. This contaminated bread eaten day in and day out delivers a continuous dose of ergot alkaloids into your system. These are powerful psychoactive and vasoconstrictive chemicals. And because you're likely eating rye bread with most meals, you're getting this dose repeatedly day after day, week after week, as you work through the supply of tainted flour. You are essentially microdosing or sometimes macrodosing on natural toxins without even knowing it. Joke 3, talk about your breakfast getting a little edgy. This is the insidious nature of the threat. It's not a sudden poison that makes you visibly ill immediately after one meal. It's a slow, cumulative contamination baked into your most fundamental food source. It's hidden, misunderstood, and unavoidable with the knowledge and technology available in 1692. And it's about to start having some very, very strange effects. You've been eating this bread day after day. It's your breakfast, your midday meal maybe, part of your meager supper. It's the foundation of your diet, your energy source for grinding work in the fields or keeping the home running. And gradually, subtly, at first, things start to feel wrong. It's not a sudden dramatic illness like the plague or a violent fever that strikes you down in days. It's more insidious, creeping in like a shadow. You might notice a strange tingling sensation in your fingers or toes. A pins and needles feeling, maybe like they've fallen asleep, but it doesn't go away when you shake them. At first you dismiss it. Just poor circulation, perhaps, from working out in the cold, or maybe you slept funny. But the tingling persists. It might even spread, climbing up your hands and feet, sometimes feeling more like itching deep and persistent beneath the skin. You rub them, scratch them, but the sensation remains. Then comes the cold. Your hands and feet start to feel unnaturally cold, even when you are inside by the fire, even under layers of rough wool clothing. They feel icy to the touch, and you find yourself constantly trying to warm them, rubbing them together, sticking them under your armpits, holding them close to the fire's embers. It's a deep, penetrating coldness, as though the warmth just can't reach your extremities. This is the beginning of the ergot's work. It's vasoconstrictive magic, starting to tighten your blood vessels, particularly in the furthest reaches of your body. Less blood flows, less warmth reaches your fingers and toes. But soon the cold gives way to something else entirely. The tingling and itching transform into a burning sensation. It starts in your fingertips, your toes spreading up your limbs like an invisible flame. It's excruciating. You feel as though your hands and feet are literally on fire, searing from the inside out. Yet paradoxically, they still feel cold to the touch. The pain is relentless, gnawing, preventing sleep, making it impossible to focus on your chores or your work. This agonizing symptom is so characteristic that historically this form of ergotism was given names that reflected this burning torment: holy fire or St. Anthony's fire. Joke 1. You thought heartburn was bad. Try having your entire foot feel like a Roman candle. Suddenly that spicy rye bread really starts making sense. The pain isn't the only thing. As the blood flow is increasingly restricted by the ergot alkaloids, your tissues begin to suffer. Your skin might change color. First, maybe it looks pale and waxy, then it might take on a bluish or purplish tinge, especially at the tips of your fingers and toes. Eventually, the lack of oxygenated blood causes the tissue to die. Gangrene sets in. Your extremities turn black and withered like burnt wood. They become dry and mummified and terrifyingly often lose sensation, completely becoming numb and lifeless even as the surrounding healthy tissue continues to burn with pain. In severe cases, parts of limbs would simply detach. Fingers, toes, even whole hands or feet might fall off due to the widespread tissue death. Imagine the horror, the fear, the utter despair of watching your own body literally decay and fall apart while you were still alive. This wasn't something easily hidden or dismissed. It was a visible, terrifying, and often fatal condition. This was not a new disease in 1692, though its cause was unknown. Mainstream historical fact, epidemics of ergotism, characterized by these agonizing, burning sensations and gangrene, had swept through Europe periodically for centuries, often following particularly wet harvests favorable to the ergot fungus. Records from the Middle Ages describe massive outbreaks, sometimes claiming thousands of lives, especially among the poor, who relied heavily on rye bread. Hospitals like those run by the Order of St. Anthony were established specifically to care for victims of the holy fire, hence the common name St. Anthony's fire. People would pray to St. Anthony for relief from the burning torment. You might hear whispered tales of folk remedies or strange practices meant to ward off or cure this burning sickness. A quirky tidbit. Some beliefs held that touching the relics of St. Anthony, particularly a bone said to belong to the saint, could alleviate the fiery pain. Others prescribed specific herbs or poultices, most likely ineffective, or relied on prayers and pilgrimages, hoping for divine intervention to cool the internal flames. Imagine traveling miles racked with burning pain and already losing limbs just to touch a saint's bone or drink from a supposedly holy well, clinging to any hope in the face of such a terrifying affliction. Joke 2. Kind of makes you rethink complaining about a little paper cut, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the frequency and severity of ergotism outbreaks were consistently recorded across different regions, or if many smaller localized incidents went undocumented, leaving the true scale of the problem throughout the centuries unknown. The available records often focus on larger, more dramatic epidemics, but the underlying threat was ever present in rye-dependent communities. As the physical symptoms worsen, the burning pain, the creeping blackness in your limbs, you also start to experience other changes. The ergot alkaloids aren't just affecting your circulation. They're also powerful psychoactive substances. The same family of chemicals that would much later be synthesized to create things like LSD are present in that moldy rye. And they are beginning to work on your mind. You might feel increasingly restless, agitated. Sleep becomes difficult not just because of the pain, but because your thoughts race. You might feel a strange tension building in your muscles, a tightness that makes you want to move to twitch even when you're exhausted. Your vision might seem different. Colors might appear more vivid, or you might see distortions around the edges of your sight. Sounds might seem louder, sharper. The line between reality and something else begins to blur. You might start having vivid, unsettling dreams or strange waking visions. Perhaps you see things out of the corner of your eye that aren't there, or hear whispers on the wind that sound like voices. Your mood might swing wildly. Moments of intense anxiety or fear might be followed by periods of strange calm or even euphoria. Joke 3. Forget good vibes only. This is more like, what dimension am I in now? Vibes. The villagers around you are also likely experiencing similar symptoms. You see neighbors with that waxy pallor, the constant rubbing of hands, the pained winces, the visible blackening limbs wrapped in rags. You talk amongst yourselves, sharing descriptions of the burning, the tingling, the cold. You compare notes on how little sleep you've gotten, how strange your thoughts feel. But you don't connect it to the bread. Why would you? It's the food that sustains you, the harvest you work so hard for. It must be something else. A sickness spreading through the air. A curse laid upon the village. Divine punishment for some communal sin. The explanations you grasp for are rooted in your understanding of the world. A world where illness comes from humors, miasmas, or the supernatural, not from the very food on your table. The stage is set. The physical agony of the burning fire is taking its toll, weakening bodies and minds. And the subtle and not so subtle psychoactive effects are beginning to take hold, planting the seeds for the bizarre and terrifying events that are about to unfold. Your reality, already distorted by pain and fear, is about to be twisted further by the chemicals coursing through your veins, delivered daily by your unsuspecting baker. The burning limbs are just the beginning of the nightmare. The fire in your limbs still burns, sometimes a dull ache, sometimes a searing torment. But now another kind of weirdness is taking hold. As the physical suffering weakens your body, something far stranger, far more unsettling begins to occupy your mind. The tingling, the cold, the searing heat. Those were clear physical sensations, albeit terrifying ones. But this new phase is different. It's happening inside. Your head warping your very perception of reality. It starts subtly, a flicker of movement out of the corner of your eye when you know nothing is there. A shadow that seems deeper, more menacing than it should be. You blink, turn your head, and it's gone. You dismiss it as tiredness or the flickering firelight playing tricks. But then it happens again. And again. Maybe you start hearing things. A faint whisper on the wind that sounds almost like a voice calling your name, or the creak of floorboards in an empty room when you're sure you're alone. Your senses, your most basic tools for understanding the world, are starting to betray you. These aren't just fleeting moments anymore. They intensify, becoming more vivid, more insistent. The shadows don't just flicker, they seem to coalesce into vague, shifting shapes. The whispers become clearer, sometimes seeming to form words, though their meaning is elusive and often terrifying. You might see things directly in front of you now, not just in your peripheral vision. Distortions in familiar objects. A chair leg that seems to writhe, a pattern on the wall that swirls and pulses. Faces in the wood grain, eyes in the darkness. The world around you is becoming fluid, unreliable, terrifying. You try to rationalize it, to push it away. It's the lack of sleep. It's the pain making you delirious. It's a fever dream that hasn't quite ended when you wake. But it persists throughout the day, through the night, a constant, unnerving companion. You find yourself second-guessing everything you see and hear. Did that really happen? Or was it just in my head? Am I going mad? The fear that gnaws at you isn't just the fear of the burning sickness anymore. It's the fear of losing your grip on reality itself. The ergot alkaloids coursing through your system, particularly lysergic acid derivatives, the same chemical family that would later be isolated and synthesized into LSD, remember that are potent psychoactive compounds. They mess with the neurotransmitters in your brain, particularly serotonin, which plays a crucial role in mood perception and cognition. When these chemicals bind to the same receptors as serotonin, they don't just mimic its effects. They scramble the signal, sending your brain on a wild, unpredictable trip. Your visual cortex, your auditory processing centers, your emotional regulation systems, they're all being hit by this chemical onslaught, leading to these bizarre sensory experiences and intense emotional states. You might experience synesthesia, where senses get mixed up, perhaps seeing colors when you hear sounds or tasting textures. Your sense of time can warp, moments stretching into eternity or entire hours vanishing in a blink. Your mood might swing violently, from crippling fear and paranoia to moments of strange detached observation, or even fleeting unsettling euphoria that feels entirely out of place given your physical agony and the terror of the visions. Joke 1. On the plus side, laundry day is suddenly way more interesting. The towels are having a philosophical debate apparently, but the visions and sounds are often not pleasant. They can be menacing, threatening, filled with unsettling imagery that taps into your deepest fears. Twisted figures, unnaturally large animals, voices that seem to hiss accusations or make impossible demands. You might see glimpses of hellish landscapes or feel a malevolent presence nearby that you can't quite locate. This isn't recreational. This is terrifying, involuntary, and feels intensely real. You look at your neighbors and you start to notice things. That vacant, wide-eyed stare, the way someone flinches as if swatting away an invisible fly, the hushed, fearful conversations about strange occurrences. You start comparing notes cautiously at first. Have you seen anything strange lately? And the hesitant replies confirm your worst fears. You are not alone in this descent into unreality. Others are seeing and hearing things too. Different things maybe, but all equally terrifying and inexplicable. This shared experience of bizarre hallucinations and terrifying visions is fertile ground for panic in a community already grappling with physical illness, death, and hardship. In a time when the line between the natural and the supernatural was much blurrier, when sickness was often seen as punishment or the work of malevolent forces, these experiences couldn't just be dismissed as simply being ill. They had to be interpreted. And the interpretations available were often steeped in religious belief and fear of the devil. Mainstream historical fact. Throughout history, particularly in communities reliant on wry outbreaks of ergotism, especially the convulsive or hallucinatory forms, which can occur alongside or instead of the gangrenous form, have coincided with periods of intense religious fervor, accusations of witchcraft and mass hysteria. The visions, the muscle spasms, the delirium. They fit perfectly within the existing framework of demonic possession, witchcraft, or divine wrath. To people experiencing such profound and terrifying alterations in their perception, and with no scientific understanding of fungi or alkaloids, the most logical explanation was that they were being afflicted by supernatural forces. Joke 2. So just to be clear, the bad trip explanation wasn't exactly in the medical textbooks yet. You hear the stories circulating. Someone saw the shape of the devil in the woods. Someone heard a voice whispering temptations. Someone felt an invisible hand pushing them. These aren't seen as symptoms of illness. They are seen as proof. Proof that dark forces are at work in the village. Proof that someone is in league with the devil, sending these afflictions upon the innocent. The fear of the unknown quickly morphs into fear of the known enemy. The witch, the sorcerer, the agent of Satan. The terrifying visions combined with the intense pain and physical weakness create a state of extreme vulnerability and heightened suggestibility. You are exhausted in agony, and your own mind is betraying you. When a trusted authority figure, a minister, a magistrate, offers an explanation that fits the terrifying reality you are experiencing, you are likely to grasp onto it. If they tell you that the strange things you see and hear are the work of witches, it makes sense of the chaos. It provides a target for the fear and the suffering. Quirky tidbit. Some historical accounts of ergotism describe sufferers developing uncontrollable muscle spasms and contortions, sometimes interpreted as fits or seizures. These physical manifestations, often accompanied by the terrifying hallucinations, could easily be mistaken for signs of demonic possession or the effects of a witch's curse, further fueling the belief in supernatural causes. Imagine seeing someone you know well suddenly seized by violent spasms, their limbs twisting unnaturally while they cry out about seeing terrible things. This wasn't just abstract fear, it was happening to people. You knew people in your own community. Joke 3. Modern doctors probably would have prescribed a lie down and some water. 17th century diagnosis. Definitely a pact with the devil. Different times. Historians still argue whether ergotism was the primary driver of specific historical witch panics, like the one in Salem, or if it was one contributing factor among many amplifying existing social tensions, religious beliefs, and psychological stressors. While the symptoms of ergotism, particularly the hallucinatory and convulsive forms, align strikingly with descriptions given by some accusers in trials like Salem, it's challenging to definitively prove ergot was present in the food consumed by all those affected, or to what degree it influenced individual testimony versus suggestion or deliberate fabrication. But for you living through it, the cause doesn't matter. What matters is the terrifying reality of your experience, the burning in your limbs, the blackening of your skin, and now the visions that plague your waking hours and fill your nightmares. Your body is failing and your mind is under siege. and the fear is palpable, spreading like wildfire through the village. As more people report seeing strange things, hearing strange sounds, feeling afflicted in inexplicable ways, the search for an explanation becomes desperate. And in a world that believes in the active presence of evil, that search is likely to lead down a very dark path. The stage is being set for suspicion, accusation, and terror on a scale that will leave deep scars. Your personal nightmare is about to become a communal frenzy. The physical pain might ebb and flow, leaving you moments of relative clarity, but the fear born from the visions is a constant gnawing presence. You can't unsee the twisting shadows, unhear the whispers that slither into your mind when silence falls. And the worst part, you know you're not alone. You've seen the same haunted look in your neighbor's eyes, heard their hushed, trembling voices describe things that sound terrifyingly familiar, even if the specifics differ. The man down the lane saw imps dancing in his barn. Old Mrs. Gable saw her deceased mother's face contorted into a sneer in her window pane. The miller swears the flour sacks were breathing. Joke 1. Okay, to be fair, sometimes flour sacks do breathe, especially if you're trying to lift them, but probably not in a demonic way. This shared terror creates a strange bond, a desperate need to understand why this is happening. You're already weak from the illness, exhausted from lack of sleep, your mind battered by the relentless hallucinations. You are frankly ripe for suggestion. And in a world without germ theory, without an understanding of microscopic fungi, without neurology as a field of study, the explanations available are limited, and they are almost exclusively supernatural. When your body is seized by inexplicable fits, when your mind conjures up terrifying vivid realities that aren't there, when you feel like you are being tormented by unseen forces, the simplest, most compelling explanation in the 17th century is that you are being tormented by unseen forces. And in Christian Europe, those forces have names: Satan and his earthly agents, the witches. Suddenly, every misfortune that has ever befallen the village takes on a new sinister light. The cow that died mysteriously last winter, not sickness but a curse. The poor harvest, witchcraft. The child's sudden fever, bewitchment. And these new horrifying afflictions, the burning, the gangrene, the fits, the visions, are the ultimate proof that the devil walks among you, working through human vessels. Joke 2. So you know that neighbor whose cat always stares at you weirdly. Yeah, probably working for the other team. The fear starts to turn inward. If these afflictions are being sent by witches, who are they? They must be here in your community. They look like you, walk among you, perhaps even attend church with you. The shared suffering, instead of fostering solidarity, begins to breed suspicion. Every glance is scrutinized. Every odd behavior, every long-held grudge, every difference of opinion is now reinterpreted as potential evidence of a pact with the devil. Remember that argument you had with your neighbor about the fence line last spring? Now when your rye bread makes your limbs burn and you see monstrous figures in the fire, you remember their parting words. You'll regret this. Were they just angry, or were they laying a curse? That old woman who lives alone, who talks to herself and knows a bit about herbs, is she just eccentric, or is she communing with spirits? The person who seemed a little too cheerful despite the hardships, are they just resilient, or are they getting help from dark powers? Quirky tidbit. In many historical witch trials, seemingly innocuous or even positive traits could be twisted into accusations. Knowing how to heal with herbs could become proof of unnatural power. Surviving hardship could be seen as having unnatural protection. Even crying or not crying during an accusation could be interpreted as evidence of guilt or innocence, depending on the bias of the accusers and judges. Your very nature, your quirks, your past interactions, all could be turned against you in this climate of fear. The whispers begin quietly, just murmurs in the marketplace or around the well. Did you hear what happened to Thomas? He says he saw things. Old Martha was looking at my house strangely yesterday, and today I woke up with this terrible burning. The individual terrors, the shared symptoms, are woven together by gossip and fear into a narrative of supernatural attack. The community's desperate need for an explanation, a target for their suffering, finds its focus. Mainstream historical fact. Witch panics throughout history were often triggered or exacerbated by periods of crisis, disease, famine, social upheaval. These events created intense anxiety and a desire to find a cause and a scapegoat. In communities already struggling, attributing suffering to a malevolent human agent, a witch provided a concrete enemy to fight a way to understand and potentially combat the overwhelming invisible forces that seem to be destroying them. The psychological pressure is immense. You are in agony, terrified by visions your mind is creating, surrounded by neighbors who are also terrified and looking for someone to blame. You might even start to suspect yourself, wondering if some unknown sin has opened you up to this torment, or if the visions themselves are temptations from the devil. This self-doubt only fuels the collective paranoia. Joke 3, it's like a really intense, really terrifying group therapy session where everyone's convinced someone else brought the demons. As the accusations begin, they don't necessarily start with the most popular or powerful people. Often the first targets are those already on the fringes, the poor, the elderly, those with physical or mental differences, those who have somehow offended someone powerful, or simply those who don't conform. They are the easiest to believe, are different to believe, are capable of such malice. Their differences become evidence. Their past troubles, their eccentricities, their misfortunes, everything is twisted into proof of their malevolent nature. Historians still argue whether the accusers in witch trials genuinely believed they were afflicted by witchcraft, or if some were motivated by malice, land disputes, or other personal vendettas, using the prevailing belief system as a weapon. It's likely a complex mix. While the physical and psychological effects of ergotism could certainly create genuine belief in supernatural torment, the framework of witchcraft provided a ready-made explanation and a way to leverage personal animosities within that framework. The shared hallucination combined with the cultural belief in witches could easily lead someone who genuinely felt tormented to point a finger at someone they disliked or distrusted. You see the fear in people's eyes turn to anger. They are suffering. Their families are suffering. They want it to stop. And if the visions and the sickness are the work of witches, then getting rid of the witches will make it stop. The logic, twisted as it is by panic and misunderstanding, is brutally simple. The whispers turn into accusations. The accusations turn into demands for action. People are named, fingers are pointed. The hunt for the human cause of the supernatural affliction has begun. And once that hunt starts, it gathers a terrifying momentum, feeding on fear, suspicion, and the desperate need for relief. The individual suffering you have endured is about to be swept up into a wave of communal hysteria. The whispers become shouts. That gnawing suspicion you felt mirrored in the eyes of your neighbors crystallizes into a terrible certainty. The shared suffering is no longer just a mystery, it has a name, and that name is whispered, then yelled across the muddy lanes and through the drafty cottages. Witches, they are the cause. They walk among you, inflicting this burning agony, conjuring these monstrous visions, poisoning the very bread you eat. And once that name is spoken aloud, the hunt is on. The people who were already vulnerable, already a little outside the tight-knit circle of community life, the elderly widow living alone, the person with a sharp tongue or an unusual habit, perhaps someone who inherited a bit of land others coveted, become the first targets. It's easier to believe that they are different, that they could have made a pact with dark forces. Their differences, which once might have simply made them subjects of gossip, now become sinister proof. Did they look away too quickly? Did they mutter to themselves? Did their cow give less milk this spring than usual? Everything is reinterpreted through the lens of terror and accusation. Someone, perhaps writhing in a fit or just recovering from a terrifying vision, points a trembling finger. It was her, I saw her in my dream, twisting my insides. Or, he came to me last night, standing at the foot of my bed, laughing as the fire spread through my veins. This is the terrifying evidence that fuels the panic. It's not just physical symptoms anymore. It's the testimony of the afflicted describing their tormentors based on what their hallucinating minds conjured. In a world that firmly believed in the devil's power and the ability of witches to torment people through supernatural means, these visions are taken as literal truth, as concrete as seeing someone pick your pocket. Joke 1. So basically, it was the 17th century version of blaming your bad dreams on that weird neighbor, but with much higher stakes, like way higher. This concept where the testimony of the afflicted about seeing the accused person's spirit or specter tormenting them is accepted as proof is known as spectral evidence. And in this panic where so many people are genuinely suffering terrifying, vivid hallucinations due to ergotism, spectral evidence becomes the primary horrifying engine driving the accusations forward. Your visions, the monstrous figures you saw, the burning pain you felt. You genuinely believe these torments were sent by the person you saw in your hallucination or by the person your neighbors are now pointing at. You might be called upon to testify, even if you didn't hallucinate a specific person. Your burning limbs, your fits, your descriptions of the terrifying landscapes your mind created, all of it adds to the weight of the communal affliction, reinforcing the belief that this is a supernatural attack. The authorities, local magistrates, or appointed officials are faced with a community in agony, desperate for answers, offering up this powerful, consistent in its typesauer of torment testimony of supernatural assault, mainstream historical fact. The acceptance of spectral evidence was highly controversial even at the time of major witch panics. In places like colonial New England during the Salem witch trials, contemporaneous with this panic and sharing chilling similarities, the reliance on spectral evidence was later questioned and became a key reason for the eventual collapse of the trials and subsequent apologies. However, in the throes of widespread panic and faced with seemingly overwhelming testimony from numerous afflicted individuals, many authorities initially accepted it. The atmosphere becomes thick with fear. You watch as neighbors you've known your whole life are brought before officials, their faces etched with terror or confusion. Accusations fly sometimes based on the spectral testimony, sometimes on old grievances, sometimes on the flimsiest of pretexts. Perhaps a cow died after the accused looked at it, or a child fell ill after refusing to eat a pastry they offered. Joke 2. Note to self, never decline a neighbor's questionable-looking pastry during a potential witch panic. Just eat the mysterious, possibly enchanted treat. The pressure to conform to believe the accusations is immense. To doubt the afflicted is to doubt the victims. To doubt the witchcraft narrative is to stand against the tide of communal fear and religious conviction. It's a brave or foolish person who speaks up in defense of the accused when the air crackles with paranoia and the suffering is so real and widespread. The panic feeds on itself, each new accusation, each confession often coerced through pressure, lack of sleep, or continued symptoms confirming the terrible narrative. Quirky tidbit. Some accused witches were subjected to physical examinations to find witches' marks, supposed spots on the body where the devil had touched them or where their familiars, demonic pets, would feed. These marks could be moles, birthmarks, scars, or anything else as slightly unusual. Often a pin was used to prick the mark. If it didn't bleed or cause pain, it was considered proof of a witch's mark, ignoring the fact that lack of sensation could be due to nerve damage or other medical conditions. The accused, often bewildered and terrified, find themselves trapped. Denying the charges is seen as further proof of their pact with the devil, who gives them the strength to lie. Confessing even falsely offers a slim chance of leniency, but confirms the reality of witchcraft for the community and dooms others who might be named in their confession. Many are subjected to interrogation under conditions that would break even the strongest will, their minds already perhaps weakened by illness, fear, and lack of sleep. Historians still argue whether the magistrates and clergy leading these initial inquiries genuinely believed every accusation, or if they were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of testimony and the intensity of the communal panic, perhaps feeling pressured to act decisively to appease the terrified populace and address what was perceived as a spiritual crisis. It was likely a complex interplay of genuine belief in witchcraft, fear of the unknown affliction and social pressure, and perhaps in some cases, personal bias. You watch as the first individuals are taken away, their fate uncertain but ominous. The naming of names has begun. The community's desperate need for a scapegoat has found its initial targets, and the cycle of accusation, fear, and evidence based on a shared biological poisoning is accelerating, pulling everyone into its terrifying orbit. The individual nightmare of your burning limbs and hallucinating mind is now inextricably linked to the public spectacle of accusations and the chilling growing list of suspected witches. Joke 3. So you thought Neighborhood Watch was intense? Try Neighborhood Watch when everyone thinks their neighbor might be trying to turn them into a newt. Suddenly, leaving your rake on the lawn feels less like laziness and more like potential spell-casting paraphernalia. The panic is no longer a quiet internal dread. It's a roaring fire consuming the village. That naming of names, that terrible first casting of stones, is only the beginning. The fire isn't contained. It leaps from house to house, fanned by fear and the persistent, maddening symptoms. Once a few people are accused, the pressure mounts exponentially. The authorities, desperate to understand and stop the affliction, press the accused for names of accomplices. Under interrogation, exhausted, terrified perhaps, still wrestling with the remnants of terrifying visions, or racked by muscle spasms, the accused might speak names. Names suggested by the interrogators. Names of people they resented, names pulled from the distorted landscape of their ergot-addled minds. Or perhaps they refuse to name anyone, and that refusal is taken as proof of their stubborn, devil-given resistance, further tightening the noose. Joke 1. It's kind of like trying to remember where you put your keys when you're half asleep, except instead of keys, you're trying to remember which neighbor you supposedly made a pact with Satan alongside. Higher stakes, lower cognitive function. Meanwhile, the afflicted continue to suffer. Their fits, their visions, their burning skin. It doesn't stop just because someone is arrested. This ongoing agony fuels the panic, reinforces the narrative. Every twitch, every scream, every description of a shadowy figure standing over them in the night is interpreted as further evidence of witchcraft, and every new name uttered by the suffering or the accused feels like confirmation. The net widens, pulling in more people. The respected elder who argued against the first accusations, the prosperous farmer whose land is suddenly envied, the midwife whose difficult delivery ended tragically years ago. Old grudges, social tensions, and random misfortune suddenly take on sinister meaning. You watch as the officials, the local magistrate, maybe the constable, perhaps even a minister, arrive at another cottage, the grim purpose clear on their faces. There's a hushed consultation, a knock on the door, and then the person you know emerges, their face pale, their hands bound, led away through the now silent street. This isn't just gossip anymore. It's official. The accusations have moved from the realm of fearful whispers to the formal process of arrest and examination. The legal machinery, such as it is in this remote, frightened village, grinds into motion. The initial examinations often don't take place in a grand courtroom. They might happen in the local meeting house, a tavern room pressed into service, or even the magistrate's own home. It's a stark, intimidating setting. The accused stands before stern, serious men surrounded by witnesses, sometimes including the afflicted themselves, who might cry out in pain or fall into fits upon seeing the accused, which is taken as powerful, undeniable proof. The questions are designed to elicit confession, not explore innocence. Have you tormented these people? How long have you been in league with the devil? Who else is in your coven? Mainstream historical fact. In many witch trials throughout Europe and colonial America, the examination phase was crucial and heavily weighted against the accused. Unlike modern legal systems, the burden of proof often felt like it was on the accused to disprove their connection to the devil, a nearly impossible task given the nature of the charges and the accepted forms of evidence. Confessions, even those clearly coerced, were highly valued. The atmosphere is thick with accusation and expectation. Every hesitant answer is seen as evasion. Every denial is proof of the devil's influence, giving the witch strength to lie. The accused might be searched for witch marks again, or asked to recite prayers with stumbling over words, seen as a sign of their unholy nature. Joke 2. It's basically the world's worst pop quiz, where failing gets you arrested and passing is also grounds for suspicion, because you're obviously faking your piety. There's no winning. The spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted saying they saw the accused's spirit tormenting them, continues to be a primary form of proof despite its inherent unreliability. Quirky tidbit, another test, sometimes used though varying by region and time, involved asking the accused to touch the afflicted person during their fits. If the touch caused the fit to stop or worsen, it was considered significant evidence of guilt. This was based on the belief that a witch's touch had supernatural power, either to inflict or perversely to temporarily relieve the torment they caused. Imagine standing there accused of terrible things, knowing you are innocent, yet surrounded by people who are convinced of your guilt, some writhing in genuine pain they attribute to you. Your own body might still be recovering from the ergot's effects, leaving you weak, disoriented, perhaps even hallucinating yourself, making it difficult to think clearly or speak coherently. Your confusion, your fear, your physical symptoms, All can be twisted and used against you as further proof of your unnatural state. Historians still argue whether the officials conducting these examinations were genuinely malicious, or if they were acting out of a sincere, albeit misguided and terrified belief in the reality and pervasive threat of witchcraft, coupled with immense pressure from a panicking community and their own adherence to contemporary legal and religious frameworks. It's hard to know if they were exploiters or simply fellow victims of mass hysteria and the lack of understanding of the true cause of the village's suffering. As the examinations continue, a pattern emerges. More names are brought forward, more people are arrested. The list of the accused grows longer, pulling at the seams of the community. What started as shared illness has spiraled into a public crisis, a legal nightmare unfolding under the shadow of fear and profound misunderstanding. You see the terror in the eyes of those taken away, and you feel a chilling dread. The panic is deepening, and no one seems truly safe from its reach. Joke 3. At this point, staying home and pretending you don't exist seems like a solid life plan. Unfortunately, that might also look suspicious. Guess we're just living our best terrified, potentially accused witch lives. The examinations, grim and terrifying as they were often just the prelude. You see the cart rattle down the muddy track, carrying the accused away from the familiar village, towards the larger town where a jail exists, where the formal legal process can grind forward. For those accused of witchcraft, imprisonment was no walk in the park. Forget your cozy modern prison with 3 meals a day and questionable reality TV. Joke 1. This was more like a medieval Airbnb review, drafty, damp, rat-infested. Host didn't respond to urgent requests about spectral torment. 2 stars only because the wall moss was vaguely green. These were often dark, unheated, unsanitary dungeons or holding cells, repurposed basements or outbuildings designed for security, not comfort or health. Imagine the cold seeping into your bones, the smell of damp earth and human waste. The echoing silence broken only by the scuttling of vermin or the moans of other prisoners. You are isolated, cut off from your family, your friends, the world you knew. News from the village is slow to arrive, often distorted by rumor and fear. You hear whispers of more accusations, more arrests, the panic deepening back home. Each piece of news tightens the knot of dread in your stomach. You are alone with your thoughts, your fear, and perhaps the lingering physical effects of the ergot. The internal burning, the phantom crawling sensations, maybe even fragmented, terrifying images still flickering at the edge of your vision, making the reality of your situation feel even more nightmarish. The purpose of this imprisonment, beyond simply holding the accused until trial, was often to break their will. Isolation, poor conditions, and constant psychological pressure were powerful tools. Ministers and magistrates would visit, sometimes offering solace, more often pressing for confession. A confession in the twisted logic of the time was seen as the gold standard of evidence. It proved the devil's hold could be broken, that the accused could repent and perhaps escape the ultimate punishment. But confessing meant admitting to crimes you didn't commit, implicating yourself and potentially others in heinous acts. Denying, on the other hand, was seen as the devil, giving you strength to resist proof of your hardened, unrepentant heart. It was a trap with almost no escape. As weeks or months crawl by in the gloom, the trial date looms. The formal trial is a terrifying spectacle. It doesn't resemble anything close to a modern courtroom drama with lawyers battling over evidence. There were no defense attorneys in the way we understand them today. The accused stood alone, facing their accusers, the magistrates, and sometimes even a jury drawn from the terrified populace. The atmosphere is heavy with righteous certainty and fear. The prosecution's case relies heavily on the evidence gathered during the examinations and further proof presented in court. Spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted who claim to see the accused spirit tormenting them, remains incredibly potent. You hear witnesses describe how your specter pinched them, choked them, or tempted them to sign the devil's book. Despite some voices of doubt, even at the time, this invisible, unverifiable testimony is given immense weight. Physical evidence is also presented. The witch marks found on your body during searches interpreted as places where the devil or his familiars touched you, or perhaps where your spirit left your body to do mischief. Finding a mole, a scar, or even a freckle in the wrong place could seal your fate. Joke 2. It's like the worst game of connect the dots ever, where the dots are just random skin blemishes, and connecting them means you're in league with Lucifer. Talk about a low bar for evidence. Witnesses might testify to strange occurrences they attribute to your witchcraft, a cow that suddenly stopped giving milk after you walked by a child who fell ill after you argued with their parent, a churning that wouldn't produce butter despite all efforts. Misfortune, bad luck, or simple coincidence are all laid at your feet, interpreted through the lens of a community desperate to find a cause for its suffering. The touch test might be repeated in court, the afflicted writhing or crying out if you are forced to lay a hand on them. Mainstream historical fact. In many 17th century witch trials, including those in colonial America, the legal process diverged significantly from what we consider due process today. The accused often had no legal representation, hearsay, and spectral evidence were frequently admitted, and the burden of proof often shifted towards the accused to prove their innocence, which was practically impossible against accusations of invisible, supernatural crimes. Confessions, even if extracted under duress, were considered highly persuasive evidence. The pressure to confess is immense both before and during the trial. You hear stories perhaps from other prisoners, of people breaking under the strain, confessing to impossible deeds just to make it stop clinging to the faint hope of leniency. But a confession, while potentially avoiding immediate execution, in some cases, though this varied greatly by time and place, often led to lifelong ostracism, the forfeiture of property, and permanent damage to your name and family. A denial, though maintaining your integrity, likely means a conviction based on the flimsy, terrifying evidence arrayed against you. Quirky tidbit, accused witches were sometimes asked to recite the Lord's Prayer. It was believed that a true witch, having sworn allegiance to the devil, would be unable to say the prayer without stumbling, misquoting lines, or omitting phrases. Their performance was meticulously scrutinized, and any perceived error, even due to nerves or illiteracy, could be taken as damning proof of their unholiness. Imagine the trial. You stand before the magistrates, your voice perhaps trembling, trying to explain away the accusations to plead your innocence. But your explanations are twisted, your denials dismissed as lies, your fear interpreted as guilt. When the afflicted witnesses are brought forward, they might erupt into fits at the sight of you, their contortions, and cries pointing directly at you as the source of their agony. The air is thick with emotion, fear, anger, certainty, perhaps even a flicker of pity from a few observers quickly suppressed. Historians still argue whether the juries in these trials were truly convinced by the evidence presented, or if they were so overwhelmed by community pressure, their own fear of witchcraft and the devil, and the authority of the magistrates and clergy, that their capacity for objective judgment was severely compromised. It's difficult to know if they genuinely believed every spectral vision and suspicious mole was proof of a pact with Satan, or if they felt they had no other choice but to convict given the pervasive fear and accepted norms of the time. As the trial concludes, the verdict feels almost predetermined. The weight of community belief, the flimsy but terrifying evidence, the lack of defense, it all stacks overwhelmingly against the accused. You watch as sentences pass, the consequences stark and irreversible. The legal process, initiated by fear and fueled by misunderstanding, reaches its terrible conclusion for another victim. And back in the village, the source of the suffering, the contaminated rye, continues to sit in barns and pantries, a silent, invisible culprit, allowing the terrifying drama of accusations and trials to continue its destructive course. Joke 3. At this point, you might start wondering if being turned into a newt would be preferable to this legal system. At least then, your biggest problem would be finding a tiny hat. The list of the accused grows, encompassing people from all walks of life. Servants, farmers, respected members of the community. The bonds of trust fray and snap under the strain. Everyone is wary, watching their neighbors, afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of being the next one pulled into the terrifying spiral of accusation, imprisonment, and trial. The shadow of the gallows looms large over the region. The verdict, as you felt it, must arrive. Guilty. The word lands with the finality of a dropped stone echoing in the tense silence of the room. You see the faces around you, some grimly satisfied, some perhaps avoiding your gaze, a few betraying a flicker of unease quickly masked. The magistrates, their faces set with what they clearly see as righteous conviction, deliver the sentence. For the crime of witchcraft, of having made a pact with the devil and tormenting God's people, the punishment is death, by hanging. The days, or perhaps weeks, between conviction and execution are a living purgatory. You are returned to the damp, dark confines of the jail. The sounds of the outside world muffled the reality of your fate inescapable. Visitors, if any are allowed, are often ministers urging you to confess and repent before facing eternity. The pressure to confess continues even now. Some, it is said, did confess in these final hours, perhaps hoping for divine mercy, or simply succumbing to the overwhelming psychological burden, desperate for some semblance of peace, even false peace. Others steadfastly maintain their innocence to the very end, their refusal to confess seen by many as further proof of their hardened, devil-bound heart. Imagine the dawn of that final day. The air is cold sharp. You are brought out of the jail, perhaps into the public square, where a crowd has already begun to gather. The condemned are often gathered together, a grim procession forming. You see familiar faces among them. Neighbors, friends, people you shared meals with, people whose accusations helped put you here. There's a chilling irony in sharing this final journey with the very people who accused you, all caught up in the same terrifying storm, albeit on different currents. The journey to the execution site is a public spectacle. The site itself is usually on a hill, a place visible to the community, serving as a stark, terrifying warning. In this part of the world, it's often called Gallows Hill. You walk through the streets, the crowd lining the path. The noise is a low murmur punctuated by sharper cries or exclamations. Some in the crowd might shout insults, condemning you as a servant of Satan. Others might watch in fearful silence, perhaps murmuring prayers. Children, wide-eyed and terrified, are often present, brought by their parents to witness the consequences of defying God and community. It's a macabre parade, a performance designed to reinforce the community's belief in the reality of witchcraft and the necessity of rooting it out. Joke 1. You might think about how much easier this whole thing would be if you actually could fly on a broomstick. Could just zip right over the crowd and off to, well, anywhere else. Preferably somewhere with less public shaming and no nooses. As you approach the hill, the gallows come into view. A rough wooden structure stark against the sky. It's simple, functional, terrifying. The ground around it is worn bare by previous visits. The atmosphere intensifies. The ministers and magistrates who oversaw the trials are present, often addressing the condemned and the crowd one last time. They might exhort the condemned to confess to save their souls or deliver fiery sermons about the pervasive evil of witchcraft and the justice of the proceedings. The execution itself is swift, brutal. You stand beneath the rope, the rough hemp cool against your skin. The world narrows to this moment, the faces of the officials, the distant blurry crowd. There is no grand pronouncement of innocence or defiance permitted for many. The process is clinical in its grim purpose. Mainstream historical fact. While popular images of witch trials often depict burning at the stake, particularly in Europe, the primary method of execution for convicted witches in colonial America was hanging. This was the standard legal punishment for capital crimes under English law, which the colonies largely followed. Burning was usually reserved for specific crimes like treason or heresy, not witchcraft as defined and prosecuted in New England. Quirky tidbit accounts suggest that some of the accused maintained remarkable composure or even defiance on the scaffold, while others were overcome by fear or grief. One woman is famously said to have recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly just before her execution, an act that, according to contemporary belief, should have been impossible for a true witch, and perhaps sowed tiny seeds of doubt among some observers, though not enough to stop the proceedings at that moment. The bodies, once the execution is complete, are sometimes cut down relatively quickly. However, their fate afterward can vary. In some cases, they are denied burial in consecrated ground, seen as unworthy of resting among God's people. They might be buried in shallow, unmarked graves near the gallows site, further emphasizing their separation from the community they were accused of harming. This final indignity serves as a lasting physical marker of their condemnation, a potent symbol of the community's attempt to purge itself of perceived evil. As the sun arcs across the sky, the grim business concludes. The crowd begins to disperse, the silence on the hill, stark after the earlier noise. But the fear remains, perhaps even intensifies. Seeing people they knew, people they lived alongside, die as convicted witches does not necessarily quell the panic. For many, it validates it. It proves that the threat is real, that the devil is truly among them, tempting their neighbors and friends. Who will be next? The question hangs heavy in the air, fueling further suspicion. Historians still argue whether the officials overseeing these executions genuinely believed they were carrying out God's will, or if they were caught in the grip of a collective delusion driven by fear, societal pressure, and the limitations of their scientific and medical understanding. It's difficult to fully grasp the mindset that could lead educated men to send their neighbors to the gallows based on spectral visions and marks on the skin, and whether they ever privately wrestled with the morality of their actions in the immediate aftermath, or if their faith and fear completely blinded them to the possibility of error until much later. The community dynamics continue to unravel. With each execution, the web of relationships is torn further. Families of the accused are often ostracized, their names tainted by the conviction. Property might be confiscated, leaving dependents destitute. The economic and social fabric of the village is severely strained. Trust is a rare commodity. Everyone watches everyone else. A careless word, an old grudge, a peculiar habit. Any of these can now be interpreted through the terrifying lens of witchcraft. Joke 2. Your neighbor asks to borrow a cup of sugar, and you suddenly wonder if she plans to use it in a dark ritual instead of baking cookies. Maybe just keep the sugar and claim a mouse infestation. Safer bet in 1692. The legal precedent set by these trials is deeply flawed, reliant on subjective, unverifiable evidence, and lacking basic protections for the accused. Yet in the heat of the moment, driven by religious fervor and mass panic, the system grinds forward, producing tragic outcome after tragic outcome. The executions are the terrible culmination of this process, the point of no return for the individuals involved, and a scar on the history of the community. The rye, the silent, unseen culprit, continues to contaminate the food supply, potentially causing more people to experience the terrifying symptoms that are being interpreted as demonic affliction. But this understanding is still far off. For now, the focus remains squarely on rooting out the human agents of the devil as the community perceives them. Joke 3. You start to think maybe it's not the neighbors with the glowing eyes you need to worry about, but the neighbor with the slightly green bread. If only they'd had sourdough starters and food safety inspectors back then. The number of people accused grows, filling the jails, leading to more examinations, more trials, and inevitably more convictions and executions. The fear is a wildfire consuming reason and compassion, leaving behind a landscape of grief and suspicion. The hangings are not just the end of individual lives. They are public rituals reinforcing a dangerous narrative, deepening the collective trauma, and pushing the community further down a path of self-destruction, all while the real problem sits innocuously in the grain stores. The gallows stands stark against the sky on Gallows Hill, now empty. The bodies have been removed, buried perhaps, or taken elsewhere, depending on the rigid rules applied to those deemed servants of darkness. But the silence that falls isn't peaceful. It's heavy charged with lingering fear. The air seems thinner, colder, as if something essential has been sucked out of the world. The executions meant to cleanse the community, to reaffirm God's order, and vanquish the devil's agents haven't brought peace. Far from it. For many, witnessing the hangings of neighbors and acquaintances, people you knew, and perhaps even liked, doesn't shatter the delusion. It reinforces it. It feels like proof. See, the collective fear whispers. They were witches. The magistrates, the ministers, they were right. The devil is among us, and he has claimed souls right here in our midst. If these people, perhaps outwardly pious, could be secretly in league with Satan, then anyone could be. This thought, this chilling realization, spreads like a contagion faster than any visible plague. You walk back down the hill, back into the village, and everything looks slightly different now. Every shadow seems deeper. Every whispered conversation feels loaded with unspoken meaning. The faces of people you pass, are they watching you? Are they judging? Or are they too lost in their own terror, wondering who will be next? Trust, already a fragile thing in close-knit communities with long memories and old grudges, begins to corrode at an alarming rate. The accusations don't stop. They multiply. It's like a snowball rolling downhill, gathering speed and mass with every turn. Now that the dam of doubt has been broken, now that the fear has been legitimized by convictions and executions, the trickle of accusations becomes a torrent. People who were perhaps hesitant before, who had private suspicions or old resentments, now feel emboldened, even compelled to speak up. To remain silent might even be seen as suspicious. Why wouldn't you report a witch if you knew one was lurking? Joke 1. It makes you wonder if the 1692 version of see something, say something was less about public safety and more about public panic. Accusations begin to fly for the flimsiest of reasons. A cow falls ill after a disagreement with a neighbor, witchcraft. Bread doesn't rise, witchcraft. A child has a fit, definitely witchcraft. A sudden cold snap ruins crops. Clearly the devil's work facilitated by his human agents. Any misfortune, any illness that medicine and prayer can't explain, any personal slight or long-standing feud can now be interpreted through this terrifying lens. And the pool of potential targets expands. It starts with those who were already somewhat outside the mainstream. Maybe older women who lived alone, people with unusual habits, those who had inherited land or property in ways that caused resentment, or simply those who were unpopular. But as the panic escalates, the accusations begin to reach higher up the social ladder. Suddenly, people of status, respected members of the community, even those with connections in nearby towns, are being named. This is a significant turning point. When the accused were primarily marginalized figures, it was easier for the community leadership, the magistrates, the ministers, the wealthy landowners, to believe the accusations and justify the proceedings. But when prominent individuals, people they knew personally, people they depended on, start appearing in the list of the accused, it creates a profound shockwave. It challenges their assumptions, but in the grip of mass delusion, it doesn't necessarily halt the process. Often it seems to simply amplify the terror. If we're in Manayur they can be witches, truly no one is safe. You hear the names being whispered. A wealthy merchant known throughout the colony, a respected church member, pillars of piety, the wife of a magistrate from a different town. Even a former minister is eventually accused. These accusations are far more unsettling than those against the usual suspects. They suggest the devil's reach is longer, his plans more insidious than previously imagined. He isn't just targeting the vulnerable, he's striking at the very heart of the community, trying to subvert its most respected members. Or so the narrative goes. Being accused when you are a person of standing is a particularly cruel twist of fate. Your wealth, your reputation, your social connections, things that would normally offer protection, now seem irrelevant, or worse, are reinterpreted as evidence of your pact with the devil. Why would someone so seemingly blessed by God turn to Satan unless the devil offered them even greater worldly power or promised them a perverse reward? Your piety is questioned. Your good works are seen as a facade masking deep corruption. Joke 2. You realize that maybe being slightly grumpy and avoiding potlucks wasn't such a bad strategy after all. Less chance of someone interpreting your quiet nature as brooding with familiar spirits. Imagine the scene when a warrant is issued for a prominent figure. The constables arrive at a substantial home, perhaps one you visited for parties or meetings. The person accused might react with disbelief, outrage, absolute horror. Unlike the initial accused, who might have been easier to dismiss as eccentric or troubled, these individuals are articulate, well-connected, and vocal in their defense. But in this atmosphere, their spirited denials are often seen as further evidence of their wickedness, the devil giving them strength and cunning to resist detection. Their examinations before the magistrates and ministers take on a different weight. Their words are scrutinized not just for confessions, but for any slip of the tongue, any perceived inconsistency, any display of emotion that can be twisted into guilt. If they show anger, they're showing their devilish nature. If they are calm, they are unnaturally hardened by Satan. If they cry, they are trying to manipulate the court. There seems to be no right way to respond when you are trapped in this logic. Mainstream historical fact. The accusations in 1692 escalated rapidly in scale and scope, moving beyond the initial cluster in Salem Village to encompass Salem town and several surrounding communities, and increasingly targeted people from diverse social strata, including some with significant wealth, property, and social standing, a characteristic that distinguished these trials from some earlier smaller outbreaks of witchcraft accusations in New England. The psychological pressure on these more prominent accused must be immense. Their entire lives, their standing in the community, their relationships with their peers, everything is on the line. Their families are also immediately tainted by association, facing social ruin and potential economic hardship. This pressure can be used as a tool to extract confessions, even if false. The promise of leniency, or simply an end to the torment of imprisonment and interrogation, might lead some to confess even to crimes they did not commit. Quirky tidbit. One of the most striking examples of a prominent figure accused was the Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister of the Salem Village Church. His physical strength, unusual for a minister, in certain behaviors, like lifting a heavy musket with one finger, were presented as evidence of supernatural power granted by the devil, demonstrating how mundane attributes could be reinterpreted as sinister signs in the court of public opinion and spectral evidence. Historians still argue whether the accusers, especially the initial group of afflicted girls, were consciously fabricating their claims for attention or other motives, or if they genuinely believed they were being tormented by spectral visions, possibly influenced by psychological factors, community pressure, or even the physiological effects of ergot poisoning. The shift to accusing prominent figures adds another layer to this debate. Were they genuinely seeing these people's specters, or were other, perhaps less conscious or more complex dynamics at play as the panic deepened? The legal proceedings become increasingly overwhelmed. More and more people fill the jails in Salem and Boston. The sheer volume of accusations strains the capacity of the magistrates and eventually necessitates the formation of a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, specifically to handle the witchcraft cases. This court operates with a speed and efficiency that many later critics would see as a rush to judgment, a conveyor belt towards the gallows. The arguments presented against the accused become increasingly convoluted and based on subjective experiences. Spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted who claim to see the specter or spirit of the accused tormenting them, is given significant weight despite protests from some ministers and lawyers that this form of evidence is inherently unreliable and could be used by the devil himself to frame innocent people. Joke 3. You imagine trying to explain spectral evidence to a modern jury. So like you saw her ghost pinching you, right? And did this ghost have an alibi? The community's paranoia intensifies. Neighbors turn on neighbors with frightening ease. Old grudges are settled under the guise of rooting out evil. Confessions often extracted under duress, or the promise of saving one's soul, are presented as irrefutable proof of the conspiracy. Those who confess, even if they recant later, are trapped. Those who refuse to confess are seen as obstinate and hardened by the devil, virtually guaranteeing their conviction. The very air feels thick with suspicion. You find yourself watching how people move, how they speak, looking for witch marks or any other perceived sign of a pact with Satan, just like everyone else. The fear is infectious, and the boundary between victim accuser and potential accused becomes terrifyingly blurred. You might start to question yourself. Have you had unusual thoughts, experienced strange dreams, said anything carelessly that could be misconstrued? This period, as the accusations swell to include people from all walks of life, marks the peak of the panic. The scale of the event escalates dramatically, pulling in dozens, then scores of individuals into its horrifying vortex. The jails are overflowing, families are ripped apart, and the community is locked in a cycle of fear, accusation, trial, and execution, all fueled by a potent mix of religious fervor, societal anxiety, and the unseen presence of moldy rye poisoning, subtly influencing the perceived reality of the victims. The narrative is now firmly established. The devil is here working through human agents, and the only way to fight him is to relentlessly pursue and destroy those agents, no matter who they are. As the panic swells and the accusations multiply, the existing legal system, such as it is in colonial Massachusetts, groans under the weight. The local magistrates, the men responsible for conducting the initial examinations and deciding whether to commit someone for trial, are simply overwhelmed. Their resources are stretched thin, their time consumed by endless interrogations and the processing of warrants and testimonies. The jails in Salem Town and Boston begin to overflow, housing not just common criminals, but dozens of individuals accused of the gravest possible crime, witchcraft. This crisis situation, this perceived existential threat to the colony from within, leads to a decision that will be heavily scrutinized by history: the formation of a special court. Governor William Phips, newly arrived in the colony, authorizes the creation of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, a phrase borrowed from English law, essentially meaning to hear and determine. This court is specifically impaneled to handle the witchcraft cases, and it is granted broad authority to swiftly process the accused. Its judges are drawn from the colony's leading citizens, and officials men deemed capable of navigating this complex and terrifying situation. You can almost feel the sense of urgency behind this move. The leaders of the colony see themselves as being in a battle for the very soul of their society, a fight against the devil himself. They believe that the normal, slower pace of justice is insufficient to meet this threat. They need a system that can move quickly, identify the witches, and eliminate them before the conspiracy spreads further. But in their haste, they create a system that is fundamentally flawed, one that prioritizes conviction over justice. The core of the court's failure lies in its acceptance and heavy reliance on certain types of evidence. Foremost among these is spectral evidence. Remember the afflicted girls and others who claim to be tormented by the spirits or specters of the accused. The court allows these testimonies to be presented as legitimate proof of guilt. This is a monumental error. In traditional English law, while belief in witchcraft was real spectral evidence, was viewed with skepticism, if not outright dismissal. Some learned ministers even cautioned against it, pointing out that the devil could appear in the form of an innocent person's specter specifically to frame them. But in 1692, fear trumps caution. The court accepts the claims of the afflicted at face value. If an accuser screams in court and says they see the specter of the accused, pinching them, choking them, or tempting them to sign the devil's book, the testimony is considered powerful evidence against the accused. The accused who cannot see the specter, cannot physically interact with it, are put in an impossible situation. How do you defend yourself against an invisible attack that only your accuser can perceive? Joke 1. It's like being accused because someone said your imaginary friend told them you were stealing cookies, except with significantly higher stakes and way less actual dessert involved. Another deeply problematic aspect is the pressure placed on the accused to confess. A confession is seen as definitive proof, and the court and ministers employ intense psychological and sometimes physical pressure to extract them. Jails or harsh interrogations are long and relentless, and the accused are told that confessing is the only way to potentially save their souls and perhaps even earn some leniency in this life. Confessions are paraded before the community and the court as triumphs, evidence that the conspiracy is being uncovered. But what kind of justice system relies on confessions obtained under duress, especially when coupled with flimsy spectral evidence? This erosion of due process is alarming. The accused are largely denied legal counsel. Standard rules of evidence are ignored or bent. The burden of proof seems to shift from the accuser to the accused. You are essentially presumed guilty until you can prove your innocence, which is nearly impossible when the evidence against you is invisible or based on your own coerced words. You watch as the trials unfold. The courtroom, likely a meeting house or other public building, is packed. The judges sit in solemn authority. The accused stand before them, often weak from imprisonment and fear. The afflicted sit nearby, perhaps writhing or crying out dramatically as they claim the specters torment them. The tension in the room is palpable, charged with fear and righteous indignation. The testimony is often bizarre and circular. Accusers describe spectral torments. Neighbors testify about old arguments or perceived misfortunes that followed encounters with the accused. If the accused denies everything, they are seen as lying hardened by the devil. If they show emotion, it's used against them. If they manage to remain calm, they are seen as unnaturally cold and unfeeling. It's a no-win scenario. Mainstream historical fact. The Court of Oyer in Terminer in 1692 relied heavily on spectral evidence and confessions, and largely denied legal counsel to the accused practices, which significantly undermined due process and were later widely criticized as major reasons for the wrongful convictions and executions. The judges, though presumably men of some legal standing and education, seem swept up in the fervor. They question the accused often with leading questions designed to elicit confessions or trap them in contradictions. Ministers are frequently present, participating in the examinations and trials, adding a theological weight to the proceedings and reinforcing the narrative of a battle against Satan. Their questions often probe the accused's religious beliefs and practices, looking for any deviation from the accepted Puritan norm. Think about the power dynamic. You are an accused person, perhaps uneducated, certainly terrified, facing the assembled authority figures of your community and colony, judges, magistrates, ministers. They believe you are in league with the devil. Your accusers are literally claiming an invisible version of you is attacking them in real time right there in the courtroom. Your only hope is to convince them you are innocent, but every word, every action, every lack of action is interpreted through the lens of suspicion. The pressure to confess is immense. Some people do confess, perhaps believing it will save them from the gallows, or perhaps genuinely deluded themselves by the intense psychological pressure and the pervasive belief in witchcraft. These confessions, however, extracted are then used not only to convict the confessor, but also to implicate others, further fueling the cycle of accusations. Joke 2. It makes you think the 17th century courtroom must have had the worst open mic night ever. Just endless dramatic monologues and people fainting on cue. Quirky tidbit. One of the common tests used during examinations was the concept of touching. If the accused witch touched one of the afflicted persons during their fits or torments, and the afflicted person immediately calmed down, it was taken as proof that the accused was the source of the torment and had withdrawn their spectral influence. This bizarre and easily manipulated phenomenon was frequently demonstrated in court and accepted as evidence. Historians still argue whether the judges and magistrates presiding over the court of Oyer and Terminer genuinely believed the spectral evidence and accusations, or if they were primarily motivated by political pressure, religious conviction, or a desire to assert authority in a time of social unrest and fear. The fact that some judges later publicly acknowledged errors suggests at least some internal conflict or later reflection, but in the moment the court acted decisively based on the accepted, albeit flawed, evidence. The speed at which the court operates is also disturbing. Cases are heard relatively quickly. There isn't time for lengthy investigations for gathering character witnesses, though some were attempted often with little success, or for rigorous legal challenges to the evidence. The court is established in May, begins trials in June, and proceeds to hear cases and issue convictions and death sentences throughout the summer and into the fall. It feels less like a measured pursuit of justice and more like an assembly line for convictions. The erosion of due process extends beyond the courtroom. Property of the accused is often seized or neglected while they are imprisoned, leaving their families destitute. Those who manage to escape imprisonment face the ruin of their reputations and social standing. The community ostracizes those even remotely connected to the accused. The fear that if you help or defend someone accused of witchcraft, you might become a target yourself is a powerful deterrent against acts of compassion or justice. You see the consequences of this flawed legal system mounting. Jails are packed, families are weeping, and on Gallows Hill, the executions begin. The legal process intended to bring order and justice has instead become an engine of destruction fueled by fear-flawed evidence and a desperate desire to cleanse the community of a perceived evil. The judges and officials, in their attempt to quell the panic, are inadvertently making it worse, legitimizing the accusations and providing the ultimate irreversible stamp of authority on a terrifying delusion. The accused are effectively trapped. If they confess, they condemn themselves and potentially others, though they might escape execution as confessing witches, were often spared immediate execution, seen as having returned to God, though their lives were still ruined. If they maintain their innocence, they are seen as stubborn, unrepentant, and in the devil's thrall, virtually guaranteeing a conviction and a death sentence. Many choose the latter path, clinging to their truth, even unto death, a testament to their courage in the face of an insane system. Joke 3. You half expect the court reporter to just give up and start drawing stick figures of specters wrestling with people. It couldn't be less reliable than the actual testimony. This period marks the height of the official proceedings. The Court of Oyer and Terminer is in session processing case after case, sending people to the gallows based on evidence that would horrify later generations. The legal system, which should have been the safeguard against hysteria, has instead become its enabler, solidifying the terrible reality of the Great Moldy Rye Panic and its devastating consequences for the community. The machine of justice, perverted by fear and flawed assumptions, grinds forward relentlessly. So you have the grain, mountains of it hopefully stored away after the frantic labor of harvest and threshing. This isn't just grain. This is your larder, your pantry, your lifeline for the next year. But before it can nourish you, it needs to be transformed. It needs to become flour, and that means milling. Milling in 1692 is nothing like popping down to the supermarket for a bag of all-purpose white. This is a process, often a difficult one, and it's another point where vulnerabilities in the chain can creep in. You might take your grain to a local mill, perhaps powered by water, if you're near a stream or river or maybe a windmill if you're on higher ground and have a reliable breeze. These mills are marvels of simple engineering for their time harnessing natural forces to grind grain between heavy stones. Or if a mill is too far away, or if you only have a small amount, you might do it yourself using hand querns. 2 stones, 1 stationary one, rotating rubbed against each other by hand. Imagine the effort involved in that hour after hour just to get enough flour for a single loaf. It's enough to make you appreciate sliced bread in a whole new way. Whichever method you use, the goal is the same: break down the hard kernels into a fine powder. But the grinding process isn't perfect. The millstones are rough, the process is slow, and there's a lot of friction and dust. More importantly, these traditional methods aren't designed for purity. They are designed for volume and efficiency, relatively speaking, given the technology. If there are things mixed in with your grain, pebbles, weed seeds, or those dark purplish black growths you might have seen on some of the rye heads, they're going to get ground up right alongside the good kernels. Remember those dark growths. The ergot sclerotia. They look like mouse droppings, maybe a bit curved, and they were right there, mixed in with the healthy grain. During threshing and winnowing, your main goal is to separate the grain kernels from the lighter chaff and stalks. Heavier things tend to stay with the kernels. Ergot sclerotia, being denser than the grain, easily made it through the basic winnowing process. You might pick out the really obvious big pieces, if you were careful perhaps, before storing, but small or broken pieces would be indistinguishable from the kernels, especially if the light was poor or you were rushing. And when you took that sack of grain to the mill, those ergot bodies went with it. The millstones didn't discriminate. They ground everything. The hard outer shell of the rye, the starchy interior, the ergot bodies, all were crushed together into a single powder. The resulting flour would have a grayish or even slightly purplish tinge, depending on how much ergot was present. It might have a slightly bitter taste, but you'd probably just attribute that to the quality of the grain or the way it was milled. After all, you're used to variations in your food. Purity standards, as we know them, simply didn't exist. Historians still argue whether medieval and early modern populations were entirely unaware of ergot or simply accepted its occasional presence as an unavoidable fact of life, perhaps mistaking it for a different kind of seed or impurity. What is certain is that the traditional milling process ensured that if ergot was in the grain, it was going to be in the flour. There were no sifters fine enough, no sorting mechanisms sophisticated enough to remove these contaminants systematically on a large scale. It was a direct pipeline from the infected field through the crude harvesting and storage methods straight into the food supply via the mill. Once you had your flour, this grayish, maybe slightly tainted powder, the next step was baking. This is the final transformation before the rye becomes the staple that fuels your life. You'd mix the flour with water, perhaps some leavening, if you were lucky enough to have it often just a bit of dough saved from the previous baking and salt. The dough would be kneaded, shaped, and then baked usually in a communal oven, a large stone or brick structure, where families from the village would bring their loaves on a designated baking day. You'd carry your dough down to the oven, often housed in a small building on the edge of the village where a fire would be raging, heating the stones to a tremendous temperature. The baker, or perhaps just a designated village elder, would manage the fire and the baking process. You'd carefully place your loaves inside using a long peel, watching them swell and brown in the intense heat. The smell of baking bread, even rustic rye bread, is one of life's simple pleasures, a sign that all that year's labor is about to yield its most tangible reward. But here's the cruel twist. The heat of the oven, while enough to transform the dough into edible bread, is not high enough nor sustained for long enough to destroy the toxic alkaloids within the ergot sclerotia. The ergotoxin is incredibly stable, so even after being ground into flour and baked into bread, the poisonous compounds are still present, still potent, just waiting to be consumed. It's like a hidden passenger making the whole journey from field to fork completely undetected by the technology and knowledge of the time. This rye bread, this dark, heavy loaf, would constitute the vast majority of your diet day in and day out. Breakfast rye bread, maybe with some cheese or weak beer. Midday meal in the field rye bread. Evening supper, rye bread stew, or just more rye bread. A quirky tidbit about rye bread history in some regions, loaves were baked so hard they were almost like crackers, which helped them last longer in storage a vital consideration in a world without refrigeration. But this hardness didn't make the ergot any less potent. You ate it because it was available, because it was filling, because it was the most affordable source of calories. You might have occasional vegetables from a small garden patch, maybe some foraged berries or mushrooms in season, perhaps a bit of meat or fish if you were very fortunate. But the bedrock of your existence, the fuel for your backbreaking labor, was this rye bread. Think about it. The potential for contamination was present at every stage in the field, where the fungus grew on the stalks during harvest, where the sclerotia were mixed with the grain during threshing and winnowing, where they weren't effectively removed during storage where they waited, and crucially during milling, where they were pulverized into the very substance of your food. In the final process, baking did nothing to neutralize the poison. It was a perfect storm of agricultural, method-limited technology and dietary reliance, creating an environment where a natural contaminant could become a widespread and devastating public health crisis. Your reliance on this single crop prepared through these traditional vulnerable processes meant that your vulnerability to whatever affected that crop was absolute. If the rye was good, you ate. If the rye failed, you starved. And if the rye carried a hidden toxin, you ate that too, unknowingly ingesting the very substance that would begin to unravel your world piece by agonizing piece. The seeds of madness, not metaphorically but chemically, were sown not just in the field, but in the flour sack in the bread oven. It wasn't just bad luck. It was the consequence of a specific set of biological and technological circumstances converging, turning your most essential food into a slow-acting poison. So there you are. You've got your dark, heavy loaf of rye bread. It's hot from the communal oven, maybe still steaming a little. You tear off a piece. It's dense, a bit chewy perhaps, slightly bitter or earthy from the stone grinding and whatever impurities got in. But it's bread, it's food. It's the product of all your hard work, the promise of sustenance for another day, another week. You eat it because you have to. There's often not much else. Maybe a little watery soup, a few boiled root vegetables if you're lucky. But the bread is the core. It's the fuel. You eat a lot of it. And this isn't a one-time thing. You're eating this bread every day. For breakfast, for dinner, for your midday meal in the fields. You're eating yesterday's bread, which is harder, maybe dipped in broth or weak ale to soften it. You're eating today's bread fresh and warm. You're eating it because it's the most reliable source of calories in a life where calories are hard-won and constantly needed just to keep going. You don't think about what's in it, not really. You think about whether there's enough of it. Slowly, insidiously, something starts to happen. At first, it's subtle. Maybe your fingers or toes feel a little strange, like they're falling asleep, that pins and needles sensation. You shake your hands, wiggle your toes. Must have been sitting funny, or maybe the cold is getting to you. Winter's coming after all, and the chill gets deep into your bones when you're working outside all day. You dismiss it. It's just a fleeting discomfort. But it doesn't always go away. The tingling might persist or turn into a different feeling. A warmth, perhaps deep within the limb. Not a pleasant warmth, but a strange, almost burning sensation. Like fire ants are crawling under your skin. It might spread up your arms or legs. It's intermittent at first, then more frequent. It can become intensely painful, an excruciating fiery ache that keeps you awake at night, thrashing in your straw mattress. This burning pain, particularly in the extremities, becomes one of the hallmarks of what history would eventually label ergotism. It was known by a much older, more terrifying name than St. Anthony's fire. It was called that partly because sufferers often sought the aid of St. Anthony, whose relics were housed in monasteries known for treating the affliction, and partly because the pain felt exactly like being consumed by fire from the inside out. Imagine lying there, every nerve ending screaming that your hands and feet are alight, but they are cold to the touch. A truly horrifying contradiction within your own body. Mainstream historical fact, ergotism caused agonizing pain, particularly the burning sensation in the limbs, which is why it earned the name St. Anthony's fire. As the days and weeks wear on, and you continue to eat the same contaminated bread, the symptoms worsen. The burning might give way to numbness. Your hands and feet feel cold, heavy, and lifeless. You might notice a darkening of the skin on your fingers or toes. They could turn purplish, then black. This is the onset of gangrene caused by the ergot alkaloids constricting your blood vessels, cutting off circulation to the extremities. In the most severe cases, the affected limbs could wither and fall off sometimes with surprisingly little bleeding because the vessels were so constricted. It's a macabre and terrifying progression, the body literally dying limb by limb while the person is still alive. You look at your hands, the tools of your trade, the things that feed you, and watch them slowly turn black and dead. But the physical agony is only part of the horror. The ergot alkaloids don't just affect circulation. They are potent neurotoxins. They cross the blood-brain barrier and begin to mess with your mind. At first, it might be subtle again, a feeling of unease, anxiety that you can't explain. Your mood might swing wildly. One moment you're calm, the next you're overwhelmed by fear or irritability. You might become restless, agitated, unable to sit still. Sleep becomes almost impossible, either because of the burning pain in your limbs or the frantic thoughts racing through your head. Then come the muscle spasms, involuntary contractions that twist your limbs or arch your back, convulsions, epileptic-like fits that leave you exhausted and terrified. Your body is no longer under your full control. It jerks and twitches a puppet on invisible strings. These physical symptoms, the burning, the gangrene, the convulsions could affect entire families, entire villages, all who share the same contaminated food source. Imagine a village where people are simultaneously writhing in pain from burning limbs and shaking uncontrollably with spasms. The air would be filled with cries and moans. And then the mind truly begins to break. The neurotoxic effects deepen, leading to disorientation, confusion, and eventually psychosis. This is where the hallucinating villagers come in. The alkaloids, particularly lysergic acid derivatives, LSA, a precursor to LSD, warp perception. You might start seeing things that aren't there. The shadows in the corner of your simple cottage might take on monstrous forms. The familiar faces of your family or neighbors might seem distorted, threatening, or even replaced by strangers or demons. You hear things that no one else hears. Whispers, voices, terrifying screams. Quirky tidbit. Some historians and scientists have proposed that medieval accounts of demonic possessions or mass hysteria could in fact be explained by outbreaks of ergotism, given the vivid hallucinations and behavioral changes it induces. While not universally accepted, it's a fascinating idea to consider how biology might have been interpreted through the lens of supernatural belief. The hallucinations are not always visual. They can affect all the senses. You might smell strange, foul odors. You might taste things that aren't there. The world around you becomes fluid, unpredictable, and terrifyingly real in its unreality. You might lose your sense of self or time or place. Paranoia can set in. If your neighbors are also acting strangely convulsing or talking to unseen figures, it only confirms your own terrifying reality. Are they possessed? Are they bewitched? Is this God's wrath? Or is it something more insidious? Something in the very bread you eat, the thing meant to sustain you. Historians still argue whether the psychological effects of ergotism were always interpreted as supernatural phenomena, or if there was some dawning realization over time and repeated outbreaks that the illness was linked to the consumption of rye. What is clear is that in a world steeped in belief in witchcraft, demons, and divine punishment, the terrifying, inexplicable symptoms of ergotism provided fertile ground for such interpretations. When people in a community start having identical, terrifying visions, convulsing uncontrollably, and exhibiting radical changes in behavior, it is easy to look for explanations beyond the mundane world of agriculture. The psychological breakdown fueled the panic. If you believed your neighbor was possessed or had cursed you because you saw them raving and hallucinating, it created fear, suspicion, and conflict. The shared delusion, or rather the shared experience of drug-induced psychosis, could easily escalate into accusations and hysteria, particularly in a community already under stress from poor harvests, harsh living conditions, and perhaps previous misfortunes. The rye bread wasn't just a source of physical torment, it was actively sowing discord and terror in the minds of those who consumed it. The effects were cumulative. You weren't likely to eat one slice of contaminated bread and immediately start hallucinating. It was the daily repeated consumption of the ergot-tainted flour slowly building up the toxins in your system that brought on the full-blown symptoms. This is why the outbreaks weren't instantaneous. They built gradually, affecting more and more people in a household, then spreading through the village as more households exhausted their previous, perhaps less contaminated grain stores and started on the new moldy harvest. The doses varied too. Some loaves might have had more ergot than others, depending on how heavily infested the grain was that went into that particular batch of flour. This could explain why some people in a household might develop severe symptoms while others have milder ones, or why the illness seems to strike some families harder than others. It wasn't arbitrary. It was directly linked to how much of the poison they ingested through their staple food. The unassuming loaf of bread, the symbol of life and sustenance, had become a Trojan horse for madness and agony. You ate it not knowing that with every bite you were inviting the fire into your limbs and the demons into your mind. The peak of the panic passes eventually. Not because anyone suddenly understands what's happening, not because a wise elder figures out it's the bread. No, it passes because, as it always must, the harvest cycle turns. The bad grain is eventually used up or thrown away, or perhaps saved for animal feed, a mistake that would keep this going in livestock. But that's a story for another night. The winter grain is planted, grows, and a new harvest arrives in the following year. And the new grain, if the weather has been different, if the conditions weren't right for Claviceps purpurea, to thrive in that particular season, might be clean. Suddenly, the symptoms start to fade. The burning in the limbs lessens, the spasms become less frequent, the terrifying visions begin to recede like a bad dream, slowly dissolving as you wake up. People who were convinced they were cursed or possessed find their minds clearing. The physical wounds like gangrene might leave permanent scars, lost fingers or toes, but the immediate acute agony diminishes. The village breathes again collectively, but the experience leaves deep wounds. The fear, the suspicion, the memories of the horrors witnessed and experienced, these don't vanish overnight. People remember who accused whom, who acted like a demon, who suffered the worst. They look back and desperately search for an explanation that fits their worldview. Was it a test from God? Had the devil truly gained a foothold in their community? Had one of their neighbors been dabbling in dark arts, bringing this plague upon them? Because in a world without germ theory, without mycology, without toxicology, you don't blame a fungus on a grain of rye. You blame what you understand: divine displeasure, natural forces interpreted through a spiritual lens, or perhaps, most terrifyingly, the malice of other humans. If people were acting like witches, talking to unseen entities, convulsing and screaming, wasn't the simplest explanation that they were witches or afflicted by one? This leads directly to a dark thread in history, one you've almost certainly heard whispers of. Remember our timeline, we're talking late 17th century, specifically zeroing in on events around 1692. Where else across the Atlantic was mass hysteria involving accusations of witchcraft, spectral evidence, people claiming to see the accused tormenting them in spirit form, much like a hallucination, and strange physical ailments, reaching a fever pitch around the same time? Yes, you guessed it, Salem, Massachusetts. The possible connection between ergot poisoning and the Salem witch trials is one of the most compelling and debated fringe tidbits in this whole morbid history. The theory, first notably proposed by psychologist Linda Caporal in 1976, suggests that some of the physical and psychological symptoms reported by the accusers and the accused in Salem mirror those of convulsive ergotism, crawling sensations on the skin, visions, hallucinations, muscle spasms, and a kind of psychological torment or fits. The timeline fits. Rye was a staple crop in New England, and the conditions in the growing season of 1691 could potentially have been favorable for ergot growth: warm, wet spring followed by a hot, dry summer. The afflicted individuals tended to be from families living in the western, poorer, more rural part of Salem village, where conditions for storing grain might have been less than ideal, potentially leading to higher exposure. Quirky tidbit: the theory that ergotism played a role in the Salem witch trials isn't universally accepted, but proponents point to specific symptoms described in trial transcripts, like accusers feeling pinched or bitten by invisible entities, seeing specters, or experiencing sudden dramatic physical contortions, as aligning uncannily with ergot poisoning effects. Critics argue the evidence is circumstantial, that not all symptoms match, and that social and religious factors were sufficient explanation for the hysteria. Think about it. You're a young woman in 17th century Salem. Life is hard, religion is strict. You hear sermons about the devil constantly. Suddenly you start having strange feelings. See things others don't see, feel like something is tormenting you. In a world steeped in literal belief in the supernatural, what conclusion do you reach? Not, I ate moldy bread. You conclude you are being attacked by witches, by the devil's agents. And if others in your community, particularly your peers, are experiencing similar, inexplicable horrors, it validates your terrifying reality. The shared delusion, fueled by physiological poisoning, becomes a self-perpetuating engine of panic and accusation. Historians still argue whether ergotism was a significant contributing factor. The primary cause, or just one fascinating potential piece of the complex puzzle that was the Salem witch trials. There's no definitive proof. You can't test 300-year-old flower samples easily, and historical records are open to interpretation. Some outbreaks of ergotism are documented in Europe around this time with very clear symptoms, but connecting those definitively to Salem requires a leap of faith or lack thereof, depending on your perspective on the supernatural explanations. Was it purely socio-religious stress and suggestion? Or did biological factors like a silent, invisible fungus prime the pump for that particular form of madness? It's a potent example of how seemingly disparate fields, history, mycology, toxicology, psychology, and religious studies, can intersect in chilling ways. The end of the Salem Panic, much like the end of many ergot outbreaks, coincided roughly with the arrival of a new harvest. As people switched to grain from 1692 or later, which presumably had less ergot, the strange fits and visions subsided, the accusations lost their perceived validity and sanity, or something resembling it slowly returned to the community. The court system shifted its stance on spectral evidence, and eventually the whole horrific episode sputtered out, leaving behind a legacy of shame, regret, and executed innocent people. But back in Europe, these outbreaks continued for centuries. The link wasn't made quickly. Why would it be bread is life? It was inconceivable that your daily sustenance could be the source of such torment. People looked for other explanations. They might notice the illness followed a bad harvest, attributing it to bad air. Miasma theory was popular divine punishment for their sins, or still witchcraft. They didn't have microscopes to see the fungal spores or chemical analysis tools to identify the alkaloids. The scientific understanding of ergotism developed very slowly. It wasn't until the 18th or 19th century that physicians and scientists began to systematically link the symptoms to the consumption of rye, and later to the presence of the dark fungal growths on the grain. The fungus Claviceps purpurea was identified and studied. Its life cycle, how it infected the rye flowers, how it produced the hard sclerotia, the ergots that resembled grain kernels. This knowledge was pieced together painstakingly over time, and the chemistry identifying the specific alkaloids responsible for the vascular constriction leading to gangrene, and the psychoactive gesture neurological effects leading to convulsions and hallucinations came even later, largely in the 19th and 20th centuries. Modern medicine understands why the fire burned and the visions danced. Your ancestors had no such luxury. So the Great Moldy Rye Panic didn't end with a single dramatic discovery in 1692. It ended in fits and starts, community by community, whenever a new clean harvest replaced a contaminated one. And the outbreaks continued intermittently for a long time across Europe, until agricultural practices improved significantly. Better seed cleaning techniques to remove the ergots before milling crop rotation to break the fungus's life cycle, and eventually the use of fungicides, though that's a much more modern solution. The experience, though horrifying, contributed in a small way to a growing, albeit slow understanding that some illnesses weren't supernatural, but were linked to environmental factors, to things people consumed. It was a brutal, unwitting experiment in toxicology and mycology conducted on entire populations. A chilling reminder that something as fundamental as your daily bread could hold such terrifying secrets. It makes you appreciate, in a very modern way, quality control and food safety regulations, doesn't it? Imagine needing to Google, "Is this bread trying to kill me?" Except you don't have Google, just your increasingly gangrenous foot and the conviction that your neighbor's a witch. Yikes. The villagers, those who survived anyway, carried the scars, both physical and mental. They had witnessed neighbors consumed by fire, friends lost to madness, family members accuse each other of unimaginable evil. The fabric of communities was torn by suspicion and fear. Even as the symptoms subsided, the question of why lingered, often answered with explanations that reinforced existing fears and prejudices. The memory of the panic of St. Anthony's fire became part of the local folklore, a terrifying event that struck seemingly out of nowhere, a cautionary tale about the fragility of life and sanity in a world where even the most basic necessity could turn traitor. And all because of a little purple-black fungus hiding in plain sight, a silent architect of fire and fear. The air grows still now. The visions have faded. The burning has subsided, leaving only exhaustion and lingering questions in its wake. The history for now is told. The story of mold, famine, and madness. A sleepy descent into the strange corners of the past.